Queen Elizabeth and the golden age of Tudor England, the age of Shakespeare and the age of when really England begins to put itself on the path that will lead to the British Empire in the 18th century, 18th, 19th centuries. It has its beginnings back here in the 16th century. And just to keep you awake, if you look at the end of your print, there's a little challenge. Okay? See if you can get it. All right. 6 characters week. Just a bit of fun, okay? Just while we're studying the history. Yeah, we've got Queen Elizabeth. Okay. Right, we're there. All right. And we'll start with her childhood. Of course, you remember she was the son of Henry VIII and his second wife, the one whose head he chopped off, the Protestant Anne of 1,000 Nights, Anne Boleyn. And think about what this is like for a child. You're 3 years old and your mother has her head chopped off by your father. It doesn't get much more shocking than that. And plus, she's now declared an illegitimate child with no right to be a member of the royal family properly. So this must have been a very traumatic start to her life. There were a few people who looked after her, women here, Margaret Bryan, Blanche Parry, Catherine Champerone, liked the little girl very much. They loved the little girl. They were looking after her when she was the princess, and when she ceased to be the royal princess, they continued to look after her and try to make sure she got a proper education and that she was treated well. So she got some degree of protection, and she got a fantastic education, one of the best educations in Europe. Champerone taught her French, Flemish, Italian, and Spanish. I think by the end she could speak eight or more languages. All right. Latin isn't in there, but of course she was fluent in Latin as well. Then, when she was 11, now a lot of girls, if they got education, their education would end more or less when they were 11. Because that's as much as a girl needs to know. If they got anything, they would get a primary education. But this is when her really serious education begins. She comes under the tutelage of William Grindal and then Roger Ascham. And Ascham was one of the most famous educators of the period. He wrote books on education, and he was a big name in education in the 16th century. So she got educated by the best. So by the time she was 18, she was known as one of the most intelligent and best educated women in the whole of Europe. I said before that women in the Middle Ages, in general, had a better position than women in the early modern period. But of course, there were going to be exceptions, and Elizabeth was an exception. She got an exceptionally good education, and she was famous for it. And an example of this would be a book that she translated herself. And it's beautifully handwritten translation, beautifully done. When she was 11 years old, she gave it to Catherine Parr, Henry's next wife, all right, who was a sort of pseudo-mother to her for a while. And the embroidery here, okay, look how delicate it is, look how exact and beautifully done it is. She did herself, or almost certainly did it herself. But the general agreement is that she must have done this herself. It was one of the things that women did. I mean, the embroideries from that period, and even into the 19th century. Remember, they didn't have television to keep them busy, or keitai, or anything like that. What are they supposed to do when they're sitting there all day? Especially the rich ones who don't have to work. They've got servants to do everything. What are they supposed to do? Okay. You'd see them doing embroidery in many of the paintings of the period, and we've got huge collections. If you go to England, you can see in museums and things, you can see many of these embroidery designs that still survive. Beautiful wall hangings. Some of them are huge and must have taken people 20 years, some of them, or something, to complete. I don't know, I can't imagine. So she translated it from French, and she made the cover for it. So, all right, that's the positive side. She had a wonderful education. The negative side, as we've already seen, is that she went through terrible traumas. So she was 2 years and 8 months old when her mother died. She would never be able to remember a time when she had not known that her mother had died because her father ordered it. Just to put it clearly. Okay? I'm sure Freud would have a lot to say about that. Okay? From a psychological point of view. Must have been hugely damaging and influential on her life. And yes, she was probably too young to remember much about it. But then the whole thing happened again. With wife number 5. I was starting to lose count there. With wife number 5. And by this time she would be about 8 years old. And again, her father chopped off the head of the woman that he was married to, bringing back this, reinforcing this trauma from her earlier childhood. So it's almost unbelievable what she had to go through. And then after her father's death, she went to live with his widow, that's Catherine Parr. Remember, Catherine Parr was the last wife. That's the one that she gave that book to. She gave the book to Catherine Parr. And then she was abused sexually by Catherine's husband. It's like, how bad can it get? Right? And how bad, honestly, how bad can it get? It's unbelievably horrible, the life that she's having as a little girl here. It's not a normal childhood at all. Yeah, the evidence is not 100%, but the probability is overwhelming that he abused her in a sexual way. Well, you know, people often debate why she never married, but I think it's already fair. From one point of view, that gives the kind of personal psychological answer. Why would you marry someone who might chop your head off? Okay, why would you give a man power over you? That kind of power. All right? So there's that going on. And later on, there are other things, as we shall see, political reasons why perhaps she never married. But at a personal level, well, that's obviously going to have had some influence on her. Slightly more positive is her relationship with Mary. Remember, Mary is the Catholic daughter of the first Catherine of Aragon, and they had a pretty good relationship, and she also had a good relationship with her half-brother, Edward, who was a little bit older, a little bit younger, Edward was a bit younger, Mary was a bit older, she was in the middle. So, in that sense, she had a little bit of sweetener to her childhood. But, yeah, even that is going to become problematic later on in her life, as we shall see. Because if things weren't bad enough in her childhood, as she starts to grow up, she enters really dangerous times. Really dangerous. She's lucky to survive. And specifically, she's lucky to survive Mary, her half-sister. Mary's out there burning Protestants. Elizabeth has a Protestant mother and has been brought up as a Protestant. So Catherine Parr, the last wife, was a powerful protector of the young Elizabeth. But then, when she died, Elizabeth was left unprotected. So really, a lot of it depended on who was ready to kind of help Elizabeth. When she was very small, those ladies in waiting, they had some influence when she was very small. Then later on, Catherine Parr had influence to protect her. But then she died, and if you remember, she was married to Henry, all right? Catherine Parr was married to Henry. Henry dies, and she marries again, all right? And this second husband is the one who was abusing Elizabeth when she was a child. Then when Catherine herself dies, this guy decides, oh, I'm going to marry her. Right? So he's harassing her again, but with a different kind of intent this time. He thinks he's going to actually be able to marry her. In a way, Elizabeth was lucky here because at the same time as plotting to marry her, he was also engaging in a plot to replace his brother. Okay, so we've got Edward Seymour, the protector of Edward VI, the boy king, and Thomas Seymour is in a plot here to, you can see he's a really ambitious guy, he's a planning guy, he's a scheming guy. He's saying, okay, if I can marry Elizabeth, and if I can get rid of my brother, I can have both of these under my control. You! Hey, look, I'm really set for big-time power. I'm married to one of the daughters of Henry, and I'm under control of his son. So he was setting himself up in that kind of way, and he was caught, and he was put to death for treason. All right? He was scheming against his own brother, either to kill him or somehow to push him out and replace him, and he was caught, and he was put to death. So, at this time, Mary, remember, Mary is the queen, and she's kind of thinking, hey, you two guys are very close. Were you part of this plot? Okay? Mary was Mary's had suspicions against Elizabeth all along. There was nothing to connect Elizabeth with the plot. Historians think that probably she didn't have anything to do with it, but they're not all in agreement, but probably she didn't have anything to do with it. And she was probably just able to think, oof, thank goodness, Thomas isn't going to be in trouble anymore. Without a head, it's going to be difficult for him to give me any more problems. So, but that ends her problems with Thomas, but her problems with Mary are just getting started. Mary's suspicious. Were you trying together with Thomas Seymour to push out Thomas's brother and take control of the boy, Prince Edward? She's beginning to be suspicious of Elizabeth. Thomas Wyatt. Now, when Mary decided to marry this Spanish king, Thomas Wyatt organized a rebellion against Mary. Again, he was caught, he was put to death. And again, Mary suspects Elizabeth of being part of it. I don't know, I don't think there's any information about whether she was part of it, but she was suspected. I think if there had been anything that could be proved in either of these cases, Elizabeth would be dead. Mary would not have taken the risk of letting her live. But she couldn't prove anything. But even so, just to keep things safe, she locked Elizabeth up in prison in the Tower of London. Right? The Tower of London has many famous prisoners. You may remember the two nephews of Richard III that were murdered. They were killed, two little boys. They were imprisoned in the Tower of London on one night. So people went in secretly and killed them. Was it Richard, or did Richard pay or organize for that to happen? We don't know. But she was in the Tower of London for several years. And yeah, she had to be very, very careful. She even went so far as to say to Mary, yes, I agree with the Catholic religion. I am a Catholic now. I was wrong when I was little because they taught me all the wrong things. They made me into a little Protestant girl, but I'm a Catholic now. Okay? She said it to save her life. Okay? She knew what she needed to do to save her life. And she did what she needed to do to save her life in these very, very dangerous times. This is a little prayer book that she had. You can see it's in Latin here. You can see and in Italian here. And she writes in it, no crooked leg, no bleared eye, no part deformed out of kind, nor yet so ugly half can be, as is the inward suspicious mind. Whose inward suspicious mind is she thinking of? Probably Mary's. Okay. Again, if Mary had found that prayer book, it might have been trouble for Elizabeth unless she could prove or insist that it was not Mary that she had written it for. But probably she wrote it angry that her sister suspected her of doing things against her and trying to kill her. She was still quite a young girl. I mean, it's quite difficult to think that she was involved in plots to kill Mary, but Mary was suspicious of everybody. So this, written in this prayer book by Elizabeth, and kept hidden by her, she didn't show it to the guards, she didn't show it to anybody, was probably her personal message to Mary. So, okay, she survives these difficult times, and finally she becomes queen. Because Mary didn't have a child, there were two people who might follow her. Elizabeth, in theory, had been excluded by Henry when he made her illegitimate. Right? When he said that her mother and I, our marriage was a fake, and so Elizabeth she's not in line, she's not a princess anymore, she's just a little girl. I happen to be her father, she's not going to be queen. So there's Elizabeth, and then there's Mary Stuart. Mary Stuart, the Queen of Scots. Now, if you remember, I said before, Henry's sister, Henry VIII, his sister married his sister married the King of Scotland, all right? James of Scotland. So now, going down through the generations, we've got, she's the great-granddaughter, okay? So I'm not sure, how many brothers and sisters there were down the line, but here we have Mary. Please notice, this is a different Mary, okay? We've had Henry VIII and his child Mary Tudor, and this is Mary Stuart. She's of the Stuart. James, this is the Stuart family, the Scottish family of Stuarts. Okay? Henry VIII, as we said last week, his family came from... No, the Stuarts were Scottish, and the Tudors were originally a Welsh family. If you remember when we were looking at those names, some of the names were very not English looking as they go back through the generations. He came from a Welsh family, and the Stuarts were a Scottish family. This is part of why the United Kingdom was able to unite. Having a Welsh king, or a whole Welsh family that ruled the country in the 16th century, and having a Scottish family that ruled the country in the 17th century, helped to make Wales and Scotland feel together with England. Never happened with Ireland. There was never any Irish king of England or anything like that. So these two are the two main contenders. When Mary Tudor dies, the next, Edward dies. First Edward dies, then Mary dies, and we're left finally with Elizabeth. Okay, Edward dies, and we're left finally with Elizabeth. It's a toss-up between Mary Stuart and Elizabeth. Okay, basically, again, it's a religious divide as well as a political one, Catholic and Protestant. Okay, the Scotland at this stage is still Catholic. England is now it's had its history with Henry VIII, and it's been swinging backwards and forwards. Elizabeth would bring England into a Protestant frame. Mary Stuart would bring it into a Catholic frame. So this is the kind of power struggle when Mary dies. So it's between Mary Stuart. Mary Stuart is better known as Mary, Queen of Scots, and Elizabeth. Well, Mary was championed by the Catholics, Elizabeth by the Protestants. Mary was only 17, and she was in France. She spent most of her life in France. Remember, Scotland had a strong alliance with France through hundreds of years. Scotland was closer culturally to France than it was to England. on the other hand, although Scotland was still, at this time, a Catholic country, it was moving closer to Protestantism. Mary herself was Catholic, but she was in France. And complicated, right? Mary's in France, growing up from a little baby to a woman. Meanwhile, her country is becoming more Protestant, but she is in a Catholic country. She's being raised Catholic. Okay? But her country is slowly becoming more Protestant. And this means that because it was becoming more Protestant, Scotland was becoming closer to England. So, at this time, Scotland is not united in saying, hey, we want our Catholic Mary to be the Queen of England. Because they're kind of thinking, well, she's in France, we don't know her, and we're changing from Catholicism anyway. We're becoming more Protestant as a country. And in France, is there enough support from the French? Because the French might like to put a Catholic queen on the throne of England. Well, there might have been, but France at this time is already fighting with Protestants inside its own country and doesn't have the energy to give Mary the support that she needs. So Mary basically does not get enough support. Elizabeth has got powerful support, and Elizabeth wins the contest. Elizabeth is the one that's going to be the queen. But Mary is going to continue to be a problem for Elizabeth for many, many years. Okay, the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots. The main rival for the throne of England. In the end, Elizabeth became queen, and then finally, but not immediately, several years later, Mary was beheaded. And between them, their fate, their unme, really changed the course of the history of not just of England, but of Britain. Okay, let me close that back door. Not sure what to do about the timing of this class. Might be a good idea to give you a break before we get started on Mary. She's got quite a complicated history of her own. Let me just... So, the Elizabethan settlement is when finally the Church of England gets its shape and identifies itself in a fairly stable form, which is going to remain almost until now, really. I mean, this is where the foundations of the Church of England get laid down. And her Elizabethan settlement, which she makes a few months after she's become queen, establishes the country as less Protestant than some of the Protestants would have liked, but much more Protestant than the Catholics wanted. Now, it seems that she was very much welcomed by the people as their queen. There was a big ceremony, and from what we understand, it was a very popular coronation, a very popular accession to the throne. And yeah, this was her first big problem that she had to sort out. What kind of church are we going to have? And what is my position? So she makes this law. Act with this capital A just means a law. It's gone through Parliament. It's kind of law. So the act of supremacy means that anybody with a public position has to accept Elizabeth in two ways. They have to accept Elizabeth is our queen, and also Elizabeth is the head of the church. So unless they positively accepted her in both those ways, they could not have a public position. Okay? A public position would mean anything, you know, like they couldn't be a soldier, all right? Certainly, because they might fight against them. They couldn't work for the, you know, like the Shiakusho or the town hall or that kind of administration. They couldn't be politicians, seijika, okay? They couldn't have any kind of public position. They could only work like maybe as a shopkeeper, or they could do private work of some sort, but not a public position. They had to accept her as the head of the church and as the queen. And then came the Act of Uniformity, which was establishing what kind of church we have. These are the prayers. This is how we pray. And it's a Protestant way of praying. Okay? For example, Catholics say prayers for the dead. Remember? I said that before. They say prayers for the dead. You know, you could go into Catholic. My grandmother was an Irish Catholic, so if I go into a church and there are candles, I light a little candle for my grandmother. Okay? But I'm not a Catholic or anything, but I mean, I do that for her because she was a Catholic. Okay? But the Protestants don't do that. It's an insult to God. God has already decided if she's in heaven or not. So lighting a candle for her it's like saying to God, you know, please, you know, can you change your decision or something like that? Or, you know, can we influence you? You can't influence God. God's made his decision. God's decided. Okay? So that would be an example. There would be no prayers for the dead. All right? Catholics pray to the saints. Okay? St. Peter, St. Paul, guide me, help me. My grandmother liked to pray to St. Jude. Because if a situation was hopeless, St. Jude was the person who would protect you. Okay? She would, my situation is hopeless, this life is hopeless, there is no hope, so St. Jude, will you help me? Okay? And that's what she believed, okay? And she would pray to the saints, and we say prayers for her. You know, I'm not a Catholic, but inside the Catholic Church, they say prayers for the soul of a dead person. Those would not be in Elizabeth's prayer book. Okay? So she's establishing that it's a Protestant church. So these two things, which the same year she came into power, she proposed them and they passed into law. They went through Parliament and passed into law in 1589. They're called the Elizabethan Settlement. All right? And that's where the Church of England gets established in something like its modern form. So this is, you know, Eikoku Kyokai no Hajime, basically. And you might want to take a look here at Elizabeth. I'm sorry, the quality of the picture is not very good, but you can see a woman surrounded by men. All the politicians are men. There's not one woman here. Elizabeth is only here by the accident of her birth. She's the daughter of the king, and the king has no son who is alive. There is no man who has a strong right to be the king, and so therefore she is there. But all around her, all right? It's men. All right? This sort of situation of having a woman who's in the position of power at the top of the pyramid with all these people under her is pretty unusual in early modern England. It had happened in medieval times, but it wasn't something that really happened. People found it very strange, that a woman could be in that position. So, yeah, there she is, queen, surrounded by all these men, and they've got all kinds of expectations. Essentially, a woman is guided and controlled by a man in their way of thinking, in the early modern way of thinking. And right up until the 19th century, that was true. And maybe even for some people today, that's how they think. Elizabeth wasn't going to be guided by men in that kind of way. She made her own decisions. Now, I've used this word heretics before, and I've talked about heresy, so that religious dissidents, people who didn't agree with Mary, were punished for heresy. It was a religious crime. And what Elizabeth did was she said, no, that crime doesn't exist. All right, remember, Henry and Edward got rid of heresy. Mary brought it back as part of the Catholic Church. Elizabeth, quite cleverly really, said, no, that's not what we do. We're more civilized than the Catholics. Okay, so that people could go, whew, at least she won't burn us. Okay? And she's also saying, it's not a crime to have something in your heart. If in your heart you believe in the Catholic way, I can't change that. And I'll tell you what, I don't want to know. Just don't tell me. It's a bit like being gay in the American army 20 years ago. Don't ask, don't tell. All right? Is that kind of way of thinking. All right? If you believe in Catholicism in your heart, that's okay. The crime is to use your belief, and because of your belief, you do something against me, the Queen, or you do something against the country. That's treason, and we will punish you. We will put you to death for that crime. Okay? But in your heart, as long as you just believe it in your heart, that's okay. You can go home and privately with your family, you can do what you want, okay? Or just don't go out and do it on the street. Don't tell me about it. Don't just keep it inside yourself. All right? So this leads to the idea of wearing a mask in public. Many people went around wearing a mask, okay? Pretending to be something that they weren't. And we'll see that in Shakespeare and in the drama, the mask is a really, really important aspect of the literature of those times. So, religious dissidents are not going to be punished for heresy. They'll only be punished if they actually do something criminal against the country or against the Queen, and they commit the crime of treason. That will be punished, but not for their religion. And as we said before, the Church of England tries to keep a sort of middle path between the Catholic way and the Puritan way. So the strong Puritans, the Puritanism of Europe in general is much stronger than the Church of England. The Puritanism that you'll get in America today is much stronger than you get in the Church of England. They have a strong belief in the ideas of Luther and Calvin and people from the Reformation who really took a very opposite idea of Christianity from the Catholics. And the Church of England tried to be in the middle. So if you've got, I think I've shown it a little bit before, but you've got Catholics on one side, Protestants, Puritans, not just Protestants, strong Protestants, and you've got the Church of England sort of saying, look, we want to be as wide as possible. Okay, we want to try and get you to. Can't you find a way to come in? Okay, and of course they had to. They had to come in. They had to go to church. If they didn't go to church, again, there was a punishment for not going to church. All right, so they would have to pay money or something like that if they didn't go to church. So it was like, yeah, you can come into the church, and there are stories, again, there's one very famous book written about this, published by a Cambridge academic, Eamon Duffy. I don't know if you've come across him, but he's written a book called The Stripping of the Altars. And yeah, I'll probably put this up on the web page, but I think he's a double N, Eamon, I'm not sure. That name maybe gets spelt in different ways. Eamon Duffy, Stripping of the Altars. So if you're interested in this topic, he's looking at it from a Catholic point of view. He is a Catholic. But what he's saying is that the Elizabethan church, when people went into church, you imagine everybody's kind of quiet and, you know, weak, you know, praying to God and everything. No, some people would be in there going, "We don't believe you! Okay, get out of here!" Okay? Or they'd be in the church, and while the prayers, the Protestant prayers of the Church of England were going on, they'd be Latin Gode, Ave Maria, Sanctus Sanctissimus, you know, they'd be doing their Latin prayers for the Catholic Church inside the church building. Okay? Not everybody was agreeing with things, but she wanted to say, just please be there. Okay? Just be there. And in the end, you know, time will solve the problem. And yeah, she was right, really. By the time you've got children being born who don't remember when Mary was queen and when England was a Catholic country, they're losing contact with that culture. Their parents are trying to tell them, and they're saying, "Yeah, okay, if you say so, Dad," but they didn't live it. So they start to lose it, and little bit by little bit, they get kind of pulled into the mainstream church. So by the 19th century, the vast majority of the population is Protestant. So much so that finally they say, "It's okay, you Catholics, you can have your church again now. The danger is past." So, but at this time, there's no way you can have a Catholic church. And one of the things that was considered treason, this is where the distinction between heresy and treason gets a little bit aimai, a bit fuzzy. If you were a Catholic priest, well, that was treason. Just being a Catholic priest. Okay, so you could be a Catholic, but if you were a Catholic priest, then the reasoning was that you were going against the country. You were teaching people somehow to be against the country. So being a Catholic priest was still punishable by death. And it's at this time that a huge book, or a series of books, eight volumes of books, called the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, which is the definitive statement of the Church of England. It's at this time that this book was published. It was written by Richard Hooker, and it was published over a number of years, and he kind of sets up, this is what our church is. So to a large extent, he defines what the theology, the theory of the Protestant Church of England is, in between Protestant and Catholic Church. And he explains this is the line that we follow. You know, we're on this side of the line here. We don't agree with the Puritans because of this. We don't agree with the Catholics because of this. This is where we stand. Okay? So he wrote this huge life work of 8 volumes, kind of outlining the theology of the Church of England. Okay, so that's the church, or that's some of the information about the church. Now we've got the question of marriage. Like I said, they had this idea that a woman would be under the control of a man. And what did Mary do? What was the first thing that Mary did? She thought, oh my God, I'm hitting 40, well, she was 37. I got to have a husband so I can have a son. Same as her father, she thought, I got to have a son to carry on and be king after I die. So the first thing she wanted to do after she became queen was get married. And so the supposition was that Elizabeth would be the same. Well, no. She wasn't going to do this. She was close to the Earl of Leicester, Robert Dudley, and possibly she could have married him. I think she trusted him. I think she was fond of him. I think maybe she loved him. But unfortunately, Dudley got involved in a big scandal. Problem is that Dudley was married, and his wife died in very suspicious circumstances. So she fell downstairs. How many times do we hear that? Yes, yes, doctor, she fell downstairs. She fell down the stairs. Okay, it's almost the classic excuse for violence. People fall downstairs. That's the excuse. What the real reason is that somebody acted some violence on them. Okay, and that's what's really happened. So the rumor was that if she did fall down the stairs, he pushed her. Okay, or he did something else and then said she fell down the stairs. That he killed his wife so that he could marry Elizabeth. And that rumor, whether it was true or not, that rumor was enough to make it pretty much impossible for her to marry him. As we shall see, Mary, okay, your question about Mary did not care about scandals like that. That's part of the trouble that Mary's going to get into, okay? So the story's starting to heat up with this scandal, but wait until we get to Mary's scandals, which are much worse. So, yeah, apart from domestic lovers, and Dudley was the main contender there were the foreign royals. Philip, who had already been married to Mary, thought that, hey, I could marry another English queen. King of Sweden, the Archduke of Austria, the Dukes of Anjou. So there were numerous European royals who were hoping that she'd marry them. And she played a very clever game with all these people, kind of flirting with them and, kind of nampa. Okay, sort of, like, oh, yes, you're a nice man. And I don't know exactly, I can't imagine what it would be like, but she, basically, these people, if they knew there was no chance of marriage, then they might make war. Okay, especially Spain. The King of Spain, Philip, he put up with a lot from Elizabeth. But he was always hoping, maybe she will in the end marry me. And it'd be much better to be married to her than to have to fight. Okay, marriage was a much better way of making a union between countries than war. So we get Dudley. Now, her friendship with Dudley had sprung up when they were both locked up in the Tower of London. You remember Mary locked Elizabeth up under suspicion that she was plotting against her, and Dudley was locked up at the same time. This is where they met, and they remained close friends all their lives. And under different circumstances, she might perhaps have married him. Then there's Philip of Spain. husband to Elizabeth's half-sister, Mary. And yeah, he had his eye definitely on Elizabeth. But in the end, she never married at all. She became known as the Virgin Queen, which she pretty certainly wasn't. Okay, it's pretty certain that she had lovers, but she never married. But she presented herself as the Virgin Queen. And now, what we've all been waiting for, the story of Mary, Queen of Scots. Her life, if anything, was much more remarkable, really, than that even of Elizabeth. And just the fact of Mary's existence was a huge problem for Elizabeth. I mean, she's 1 week old and she's made queen. She's actually the Queen of Scotland at the age of 1 week. How's that? How's that for an interesting beginning to your life? Okay? Makes me feel like a total failure. Wow, 1 week old and she's already the Queen. Oh. And then 6 months old and she's promised to Edward, remember, he becomes the King of England. So she's the future wife of the King of England. Except that doesn't happen, does it? Okay? Doesn't happen. But she's promised to him, she's going to be married. At 6 months old, she's engaged to be married. I mean, we live very boring lives by comparison with this, okay? Look at that. In the first 6 months of her life, she's been made queen and she's engaged to be married. But the Catholics were still pretty strong in Scotland at this time, and they broke that off. They said, no, we don't want her marrying the Protestant Edward. And they sent her to France, which was their close ally. They had this strong relationship with France, and the Catholics sent her off to France, and that's where she grew up. So she's queen, she's engaged to be married, the engagement is broken off, and she's set off to France. And then, at the age of 15, she gets married. The man she marries is a prince who, within a short time, becomes king. So there she is, she's a teenager, and her husband is the king. And then, a year later, she's a widow. I mean, she's younger than any of you, and she's a widow. I mean, she's a queen, she's a widow. I mean, what a life. Okay, and things haven't even really started yet. Her husband dies, and she thinks, okay, I'll go back to Scotland. Well, yeah, she's the Queen of Scotland, but unfortunately, Scotland is changing its religion at this time. She's still a Catholic, but the country is becoming Protestant under the guidance, particularly, of this man, John Knox. He's a religious reformer, Protestant reformer, who is persuading the Scottish people that the Protestant direction is the right way to go. And the Scottish people are listening. Scotland is moving more and more towards Protestant thinking. So then she marries her cousin. This is where the scandals start. She marries her cousin, Lord Darnley. And Darnley murders his wife's secretary, who is an Italian man. Why does he murder her? Is she having an affair with him? Is she sleeping with him or something like that? Maybe. Maybe. But he murders her secretary, this Italian guy, David Lizio. And then, after murdering the person who maybe was his wife's lover, Eugene, he then also gets killed. He gets murdered. And then Mary marries again to the man who probably murdered her husband. Ta-da! Okay, I mean, look at that, okay? Her husband marries her secretary, probably because he's jealous of the relationship between his wife and the secretary. She then she then marries the person who probably killed her husband. Wow. I mean, if that situation with Elizabeth and, Dudley's wife was a scandal, at least Elizabeth, she allowed herself to be persuaded. She had the good sense to say, okay, I'll keep away from it. Mary walked straight in. She married the guy who probably killed her husband. Can you imagine what Scotland thought about this? This princess coming back from France, and they just could not believe that this was happening. All right, I mean, just like I couldn't believe the results of the American elections a few years ago. Yeah, something like that. How can this really be happening? Okay, but strange things happen in this world. Okay, and so the marriage was really, really unpopular, and she was forced to give up her position as queen. She was forced to abdicate. And where does she go when she abdicates? She thinks, yep, buddy, my cousin Elizabeth. So she goes to England looking for protection. Again, a huge miscalculation. A huge mistake, really. Because what's Elizabeth going to think? Elizabeth, oh my God, this is the woman who, nearly became queen instead of me. And in those days, if she'd become queen and I hadn't, she would probably have chopped my head off. And I don't like chopping people's heads off, but that's probably what she'd have done to me. What should I do with her? And the answer was not, I will chop her head off. Okay? I mean, she did lose her head in the end. But Elizabeth's answer was, I'm going to have to keep her under some kind of control. Yes, so effectively she makes her a kind of prisoner. So, yeah, like I say, you couldn't make this stuff up. And it's just like, wow. Okay, between Elizabeth and Mary, between them, they just had these extraordinary lives. Okay? It gets, well, better or worse, it depends how you're thinking about it, really. Because Mary went to Elizabeth expecting support, expecting her to help her get back her position as Queen of Scotland. But Elizabeth is more worried that Mary is a risk to her own stability, to her own position as Queen. The Catholics would support Mary as Queen of England. So what's she going to do? During Elizabeth's life, there were probably about 20 different plots to kill Elizabeth. Each one of them was discovered, each one of them was found. Nobody succeeded. But all of these plots were Catholics wanting to have a Catholic king or queen and to move the country back into a Catholic system. So, of course, Mary was their champion. And as long as Mary was alive, it was a risk to Elizabeth. So it was too dangerous for Elizabeth to let Mary go free. She had to imprison her. Seems like she did her best to treat her well, and she kept her in England, basically a prisoner, but in quite a luxurious kind of situation. In the end, though, she was implicated in a Catholic plot that she wrote a letter, they found the letter. She was plotting with the Catholics against Elizabeth, and Elizabeth said, okay, I'm sorry. I can't do anything about this. She's got to die. So after a number of years, in 1587, Mary lost her head. Okay? She was kept in a high-class house where she had the freedom to take a horse and ride all day. She wasn't kept as a very strict prisoner, but if she tried to escape, they would get her. She had to go back at the end of the day. She had to stay there. So she was kept, It's the same as, saying that they were in the Tower of London as prisoners. They weren't kind of starving with chains on them. They were attended to by servants. They were royalty, these people. They were very part of the elite. They were, even in prison, they were going to be treated very, very well. But she was a prisoner for all of that. And then finally, she was put to death because she was plotting against Elizabeth. I think it's fairly clear. I think historians agree that she was guilty there, but check it. I'm not sure. These stories, there's always somebody says, "Wait a minute, that's not exactly right," So, but I think that's the accepted version. Yep. Here she's shown with her head on a platter, and getting down to the nasty realities of this, quite often the person whose job it was to chop people's head off got drunk, and he did not manage to kill her on the first stroke. He killed her on the second stroke, and when he held her up her head, they would lift up the head like this, and the head fell down because it was a wig. That's it. She was wearing a wig. So here's one of the most beautiful women of Europe, and their head's been held up, and it falls down because it's another grotesque angle, situation, another kind of grotesque dimension. But that's the end then of Mary. And Spain. Spain was the big challenge at that time, really. Philip, you remember, had been married to the Queen of England. He'd been married to Mary. And he had hopes, as I've said, of being married also to Elizabeth. And he was very patient about it. He was patient when she wouldn't marry him. He was patient when English ships attacked Spanish ships returning from the Americas. Remember, America had been discovered 100 years before by Christopher Columbus, and Spain was the main colonizing power. The Xocominci of America at this stage were mainly Spanish. And the English had the policy of let the ships from Spain go off to America. All right, here's Spain. Let the ships go off to America and get gold and come back with gold. Not just gold, but other things that were very expensive, spices, tobacco, all kinds of things that they didn't have over here. And then, as the ships are coming back, the English would meet them somewhere around here and fight them and take the gold and the spices and the tobacco and everything, go back to England and give half of it to the Queen. And the Queen would say, "Oh, you're such good boys, I love you." Okay? And they were heroes. And the biggest hero of them all was a man called Sir Francis Drake. Notice that he's Sir, all right? He has a title given to him by the Queen because he gives her all this wonderful gold and all these treasures from America that he's taken from the Spanish. Now, when I was 18 years old, I went to live in Spain, and I was very shocked because my childhood hero, Sir Francis Drake, my childhood hero, was a pirate. I didn't know that. I didn't think that. I never even thought about it, you know, like he was a hero. In my education, in my school days, Sir Francis Drake was a hero. I went to Spain, and of course, for them, he's a pirate. Okay? So, Philip had been very patient with England attacking his ships and taking his treasure back to England. He put up with a lot. He was even patient when Elizabeth made an alliance with Protestants in Holland. Now, I said this Holy Roman Empire, it stretched, it was kind of broken up. It didn't include France, but there were lands around the place that belonged to the King of Spain. And Holland, okay, so Holland was under Spanish control as part of this power bloc at that time, and Elizabeth made an alliance with the Protestants in Holland. And again, he was pretty patient about it. But when Elizabeth beheaded Mary, that seems to have been when he decided that's enough. More takusan. So he realized there will never be a Catholic queen in England. Elizabeth's certainly not going to marry me, so I'm never going to be the king. There's only one answer. Attack. Attack these pirates who are stealing our gold. Attack these people who are making friends with our enemies. Attack. And at this time, Spain is the #1 powerful country in Europe. So, this leads to the Spanish Armada. The invincible, the unbeatable Armada, they called it. It set off to attack England in 1588. And Spain was the greatest power in Europe. England was a fairly unimportant country by comparison. And unbelievably, England won. They beat Spain in the Armada. One reason was the English ships were much smaller. I don't know why Spain didn't learn the lesson. They had these big ships that went across from America, and the English would arrive with their small ships, and they could dance around these big ships. They could move from one place to another. They could fire their cannon at them and then move out of the way before they could fire back, and then go around the other side. They could dart around while these Spanish ships could only turn very slowly. So the English ships were able to outmaneuver the Spanish ships in the English Channel here. It's very famous that Sir Francis Drake was playing a game of bowls. And they came and said, "The Spanish Armada are coming." And he said, "Fine, I shall finish my game. And then I shall defeat the Spanish Armada." And he did. So that's the story. I don't know how true it is, but that he was playing bowls and he finished his game before going to fight against the Armada. But this was really the turning point for England. England's war with Spain didn't end here, but it was a very important battle, and from this time on, Spain starts to go down and down and down and become less and less important, and England starts to become more and more important. So this is like the kind of turning point. And it's happening under Elizabeth. Okay then, just very quickly now, the final years of Elizabeth were not such a happy time. The fighting with Spain carried on all through the rest of Elizabeth's life. Although that important battle was won, the fighting carried on. I guess I'm not going to make too much of this, but she was again supporting the Protestant rebels in Europe against Spain and against the Catholics in Europe. And one of the problems with her support that she gave, this kind of support, was she didn't give enough. She'd give some support, and then she'd leave the soldiers there with not enough food, not enough weapons, and they'd end up getting beaten. So that wasn't popular. If you're going to support your troops in a war, you have to support them 100%. And she didn't have the strong feeling to do that. She'd get them there and then leave them without the resources necessary to actually win. So she lost popularity because of these situations. Spain was supporting Ireland, which of course continued to be a Catholic country. In one case, about 30,000 Irish people starved to death. And again, Ireland entered into open warfare against England. So these last years of her life are not peaceful, with France, Spain, Ireland all making war against her. And so her last years were marked by wars and a decline in popularity. Persecution of Catholics became more severe. There were crop failures, there were social unrest. I'm going to have to go very quickly here because we're running out of time. And a personal disappointment. Dudley was out of the picture by this time, but she was very fond of a young man called Robert Devereux, who led a rebellion against her. And she was very disappointed because I think he had been her lover. She fell into depression and she died. And it had already been agreed that James of Scotland would become the next king. Giddy, giddy. Well, there's slightly a little bit more. There, you got it. Most English people couldn't remember a time when she hadn't been queen, and her death was an occasion for great national mourning. That's it, really, on Elizabeth.